All right, thanks everyone for coming. So today I'm going to be talking about what predicts helping behavior. So humans are an interdependent, a highly interdependent species. Not only do we care about helping ourselves, we also care about helping others. What predicts helping behavior? So there's a couple different ways in which we can think about this question. One way to think about it is just whether or not people choose to help, and if they choose to help, how much they help. So this is a question that's been investigated a lot in the literature. We know many factors that influence this. So we know that empathy for the recipient of aid predicts things. We know that perceptions of how much someone needs something will predict helping behavior. We know that whether or not people like the recipient will predict helping behavior. But another way to think about this question is not just whether or not people help, but how they help. And so this, I believe, there's a couple different ways to think about how people help others. You can think about helping in different types of ways. One might be a more paternalistic approach, and another might be a more agentic approach. So what I mean by this is that paternalistic helping might restrict the recipient's choice in some ways, restrict the recipient's autonomy, whereas more agentic forms of helping can give the recipient more autonomy and agency. So let's just go through a few examples of this. Oh, there we go. So let's say that you're trying to help a poor PhD student. How would you help that poor PhD student? So one way, a more paternalistic way of helping, might be that you would purchase things for the student. So you would make some decisions about what the student needs, purchase textbooks for them, purchase notepads for them, and then give those things to the student. Okay, that might be one way that you could try to help the student. Another way that you could try to help the student might be that you just give them cash. So this is a little bit more agentic, right? Because now the student has the choice to decide how they want to use that money. Maybe the student wants to go buy beer. Maybe that would be what would help them the most right now. So that gives them more choice. Let's take another example. So say you're trying to think about a policy that would help people to eat more healthy. So a policy that might try to reduce obesity. So one thing you could do is that you could make a policy that would completely restrict access to any meals over 500 calories, for example. So this is a little bit more paternalistic. You've taken away their opportunity to choose. On the other hand, you could think of a policy that simply adds calorie counts to meals. So now the recipients have access to this information, and they can choose how they want to use it. So we began thinking that maybe the factors that underlie whether people tend to give to others or not are not the same factors that influence how they give to others. And in particular, I was interested in when does more paternalistic types of aid versus more agentic types of aid, when are those more preferred to give to others? And also, when are they more preferred for the self? What do people choose for themselves? And so let's just consider some examples of paternalism before I get to any data that have been directed towards others versus the self. So let's start with one example of when paternalistic aid has been directed towards people, and we can think about Cass Sunstein as an example here. Cass Sunstein, Harvard Law School professor, he co-authored the book Nudge with Dick Thaler. He wrote a New York Times op-ed that got a lot of attention in 2014 called Open Brain Insert Ideology. Obama nominated him in 2010 to be in the White House office for regulatory affairs, and he became very well known in the public for his what he called soft paternalistic approach. Okay, so when he was nominated to this office in the White House, he eventually got through the process. And how did Americans respond to his approach, his more paternalistic, seemingly, approach to creating policies for Americans? So what was the response to this? So some of you might remember that the response to this was pretty angry. So I think Glenn Beck's quote really sums this up nicely. He said, Cass Sunstein is the most dangerous man in America. So this is a little bit extreme, but in fact, most Americans were not sort of happy with these kind of more paternalistic policies. Cass Sunstein left that office after 2 years. So here it seemed to be the case that paternalism was not preferred. The recipients of the paternalistic aid, Americans in this case, did not seem to prefer that type of approach. Or we can think of a different example. So let's take this example. The New York City Board of Health completely banned the sale of large sodas. I think it was sodas over 20 ounces. Do you guys remember what the response was? What was the reaction to this particular policy? people were pretty angry, right? So they started calling New York the nanny state. People were upset about this. Again, it seemed to be the case that paternalism was not preferred here. So the recipients themselves of the paternalistic policies did not seem to prefer that. It didn't seem to be liked. Now let's consider a different type of example. What about when paternalistic aid is directed towards others? So here we can think about a different paradigm, and we can think about different types of charities. So different types of donations towards others that need help. You can think about more paternalistic versus more agentic ways to donate money to others. So let's take some more paternalistic type charities. These would be charities that you might all be very familiar with. So the American Red Cross or Oxfam, they all use this model in which donors might give cash to the charities, and then the charities make decisions about what kinds of things the recipients need. They make decisions about what medicines they need, or clothes, or food. They purchase these things, and then they give them to the recipients. So in 2011, a group of economists from MIT, Harvard, and UCSD came up with a new model of giving. They called it this charity Give Directly. Some of you might have heard of this charity. It's very interesting. Instead of having this overhead in which donors give cash and then people buy things and then they give to the recipients, the donors give cash and it goes just directly into the pockets of poor people in Kenya and Uganda. So they get the cash direct into their pockets. It's a little bit more agentic. So now the poor people can decide what to do with that money. So what was the response to Give Directly, this sort of new form of giving, this new charity? Some of you may remember this. So people were really doubtful about it. So all these op-eds came out, Give Directly, not so fast, don't get fooled by bad charities. There was a New York Times op-ed that said, is it crazy to give cash to poor people? So people really doubted this, and here it actually seems to be the case that paternalism is a little bit more preferred when giving to others. So these are just anecdotal examples, but they seem to present a bit of a paradox. Why do people seem to resist paternalism when it's directed towards themselves, but seem to endorse it more when it's directed towards others? And so what I'm going to propose is a way to potentially reconcile this, and we're going to also test to see if this effect actually exists, which is that perhaps it's because of the inferences that we make about the recipients of aid, about their mental capacities, that can influence how we try to help them. So let me dig into this a little bit deeper. So there's a lot of research in psychology that suggests that on average, people tend to perceive that they have greater mental capacity than do others. So specifically, people tend to believe that they have greater rationality than others do. They have more self-control than others do. They experience their own emotions more vividly, both positive and negative emotions. And so all these cases, they believe that they have less bias than others do. So in all of these cases, they tend to believe they have greater mental capacity. That's what I mean by the term mental capacity, than do others. And why is this? My colleagues and I have suggested that it's at least in part because people are egocentric. So merely the fact that because I experience my own mental processes, what I'm feeling and thinking directly from an inside perspective, but I don't experience someone else's mental processes as directly, I have to observe others' mental processes indirectly, my thoughts and feelings are more accessible to me, and so they loom larger. And so this is partly what accounts for this effect, that people believe they have more mental capacity than do others. So we want to test this hypothesis that people's perceptions of their own and others' mental capacities influence how they give to others. So we designed an experiment to test this. And in this experiment, we asked people to consider a bunch of different types of policies. So we gave them 5 different categories of policies. They were all designed to help others. So increasing healthy eating, reducing credit card debt, et cetera. And for each of these policies, we gave people 2 different options. So we either gave them an option that was a little more paternalistic or an option that was more agentic. So here's the example for increasing healthy eating. So the more paternalistic version of this policy is that you just ban certain types of food. And the more agentic version of this policy is that you provide calorie count information. So we did this for all these policies, and we simply asked people to choose which policy would be more effective here. So you can think to yourself, which of these policies would be more effective? But half of the participants were answering these questions for themselves. So this was the self-targeted condition. So they were making these choices about themselves, like imagine a policy that would ban you from being able to eat these foods, or imagine a policy that would, in which you would be able to read the calorie counts. And then the other half of the participants, randomly assigned, were making the decisions about others. So they were thinking about the average citizen, the average person. So they were reading these blurbs about banning citizens from doing this, or citizens will be able to read the calorie counts. Okay, and then we also asked everyone to make some judgments about mental capacity, and we made this really simple. We simply asked them about self-control in each of these 5 domains. So we asked, to what extent do you think that you are capable of avoiding unhealthy foods, avoiding credit card debt, et cetera? And we also asked them, to what extent do you think the average person, the average citizen in this case, is capable of doing those things as well? And here's what we find. So first of all, when do people tend to prefer paternalism? What we find is that people tend to prefer paternalistic policies. They're more likely to choose those paternalistic policies in all of these cases when they're thinking about the average citizen compared to when they're thinking about themselves. Okay, and who seems to have more mental capacity? So indeed, this is a really big effect. People reported that they believe that they themselves have more mental capacity. They're more likely to be able to avoid doing all these bad things than would an average citizen. And in fact, the self-other manipulation directly, the effect of thinking about oneself versus another person on preference for these more paternalistic policies was fully mediated by perceptions of mental capacity. So this suggests that it was because people think of themselves as being more mentally capable, more able to avoid doing these bad things. They don't think that they need the paternalistic policies. They can use the agentic policies, and those will be more effective for them. So this provides some support for our hypotheses. Of course, there are more differences between self and other than just perceptions of mental capacity. So in the next experiment, we wanted to take the exact same target, have people think about the same recipient of aid, and see if people's perceptions of the mental capacities of the same recipient would predict how people try to help that person. So in another experiment, we asked people to just think about poor people from Kenya and Uganda who need aid. So we had everyone considering the same recipients of aid. And then we measured what people believe about the mental capacities of these people. And this measure was a little bit different from the last one we used. We tried to make it much more robust. We tried to create a measure that we compiled from other types of metrics for mental capacity that would incorporate beliefs about the person's agency and their rationality and their intellect. So we created a measure that looked like this. So it had 8 different items. So we measured the extent to which people thought these poor people from Kenya and Uganda had mental capacity. And then we asked them to think about 2 different ways that they could help these poor people. So we had them think about a relatively paternalistic charity. In this case, we chose the Red Cross. And then we had them think about a relatively agentic charity. We chose Give Directly here. And we asked the participants about how effective they thought this more agentic charity, Give Directly, would be for helping these poor people. And we also asked them about how wisely poor people would spend the money that they got from this charity. So if they got cash directly from this charity, would they spend the money wisely? So we had these different items to measure these different aspects. And then finally, we gave the participants a little bonus. So this was an online experiment. It was on MTurk, so they weren't getting paid much to begin with. We gave them a bonus that was about half of what they were already expecting to get for the study, 25 cents. And we said, OK, you can just keep this money if you want, or you could choose to donate it. And if you choose to donate it, these are your 3 options, and you can allocate the money however you want. So you could keep all the 25 cents yourself. You could give half of it to Give Directly. You could give some portion of it to Red Cross. So people chose to donate however they want. And so what we're predicting here is that people's beliefs about the mental capacity of the recipients of these charities will influence how wisely they think they'll spend the money and how effective they think these more agentic charities are. And that will actually influence how they choose to donate to them. And so here's what we found. We found 2 different models that actually fit these data, and both support our hypotheses in different ways. So one was that it's true that this is a mediation model. The perceived mental capacity of the recipients predicted the difference between people's donations to the more agentic Give Directly charity and the more paternalistic Red Cross charity. So people were more likely to give more to the agentic charity if they thought that the recipients had greater mental capacity, and this was mediated by the perceived effectiveness of the more agentic charity. We also found this path that it was also mediated by their beliefs about the money being spent unwisely. And furthermore, this was robust to controlling for different things like the participants' own income, some of their political ideology, their familiarity with the two charities. And also you'll notice we didn't manipulate mental capacity in this study, but in 2 subsequent experiments, I'm going to skip it due to time constraints, in 2 subsequent experiments, we gave people information about the recipients, and we gave them the same information, but we framed it in slightly different ways to make the recipients seem to have more or less mental capacity. And then that framing manipulation affected how people chose to donate money to them. So we find the same results if we manipulate it. All right, so I'm going to share one more experiment with you. And so far, we've shown that people's beliefs about recipients, others' mental capacity, influence how they donate to them. And so we wondered if we could extend this to the self. So this also suggests that if people think that they themselves have less mental capacity, then they should be more open to more paternalistic approaches to help themselves. So if we can manipulate people's own beliefs about their own mind, then we should be able to move around how they themselves want to be helped. So we tried to do this, and we thought about how could we have an intervention that make people think a little bit differently about their own mental capacities. And so when is it that people recognize that they can lack mental capacity? In particular, when is it that people go through a self-control failure, where they recognize that they have less self-control? And so we actually came up with what I think is a really paradigmatic example of this, Thanksgiving dinner. So it's often the case that after people have eaten a huge dinner for Thanksgiving, they recognize that they overate, and they feel like they had a self-control failure. And so we're like, maybe if we draw people's attention to this moment, they'll feel like they have less mental capacity, and they'll be more receptive to more paternalistic policies to help them. So that's what we did. We designed an experiment, and the way that we did this is we recruited a pool of 200 people, and we randomly assigned them to get a survey either before Thanksgiving or after Thanksgiving. So immediately before, immediately after. And the idea there was to manipulate the accessibility of this self-control failure. So if you get a survey before Thanksgiving, you might think you have high self-control, but after Thanksgiving, you sort of recognize that you had a self-control failure, and that should be the intervention that we tried to do. And the survey was really simple, it was short. We measured 2 different things. We measured people's beliefs about their own mental capacity on the same scale I showed you earlier. And then we asked them about how effective they thought 4 different relatively paternalistic anti-obesity policies would be, such as cutting high-calorie entrees in restaurants that were directed at themselves. And so here's what we found. So first of all, it was indeed the case that before Thanksgiving, people thought they had greater mental capacity than after Thanksgiving, particularly in this one domain of eating. And then, indeed, it was also true that people believed that these more paternalistic policies would be more effective for them after Thanksgiving. And the effect of getting the survey before versus after Thanksgiving on people's endorsement of the paternalistic policies was mediated by people's own perceptions of their mental capacity. So I'm going to end with a quote that I think sums up the intuition of our findings. This quote says, "I believe that I could do more good with money for the poor than the poor could do for themselves. I assume that poor people are poor in part because they're uneducated and they don't make good choices, and they need people like me to figure out what they need and get it to them." So that's the intuition here, that people don't have as much mental capacity. They need to have more paternalistic help directed towards them. And interestingly, this quote comes from the chief operating officer of Give Directly, which is that agentic charity I kept talking about. And she gave a TED talk where she later went on to say that working at Give Directly helped her to change her beliefs about this. And so she had a change in philosophy. But this is where she started. And I think there's some really interesting implications of this work. So first of all, let's discuss some of the theoretical implications. So there is a lot of research, as I started this talk, there's a lot of research on what are the factors that predict whether people help or how much they help. But there's not as much research on thinking about how people help. So this sort of represents a foray into better understanding the different ways in which people can help others, more paternalistically or more agentically. And then also, to the extent that people's beliefs about mental capacity underlie what it means to be human. So a theory, an important theory in psychology, suggests that humanness is defined by having sophisticated ability to think and feel. To the extent that that's the case, this is a form of dehumanization. When you believe that someone has less mental capacity, they seem less capable of self-control and other things, that's a type of dehumanization. So this actually fits into a really interesting burgeoning literature on what are some of the behavioral consequences of dehumanizing others. And then practically, I think there are a couple different things to consider here too. So one thing to consider is that it may be the case that people tend to believe that they themselves have a lot of mental capacity and they don't need these more paternalistic policies, they don't need these nudges. It may be the case, this is of course an extension, we don't know this yet, that people may overestimate their own agency in some cases, and that they themselves would benefit from having more paternalistic policies directed toward them, or even these soft paternalistic policies that are just nudges and don't actually restrict freedoms. And then on the flip side of this is that it might be true that people tend to underestimate others' agency. So let's take Give Directly as an example. This is the charity I keep talking about that gives cash directly to poor people. There's been a lot of research on this charity in particular that suggested that it's really surprisingly effective. Not only do poor people tend to spend the money on the same types of things that they would be getting from Red Cross or other charities, they spend the money on medicine and food. It also improves their well-being just to have this feeling, this agency of knowing that they can use the money however they want. So it might be that people because they tend to underestimate others' agency and believe others have less mental capacity, they might miss some approaches to helping others that could be surprisingly effective. Thank you very much. Thank you to my co-authors, Nick Epley and Adam Waits. Does anyone have questions? Yes.
Can you say anything about how the subjects in your various experiments, how they compare to, say, like the population? It seemed like the first level experiments might have, were they mostly like college students?
So we have run several studies online. So we often will use MTurk as a platform. We've also done studies at the museum. There's a Museum of Science and Technology and Industry at Chicago. So that's a very wide range of adults. And so we see that they have a wide range of political ideologies. There's a wide age range across these different studies. Was there anything in particular that you thought might interact with these results?
Yeah, so MTurk samples are obviously more tech savvy, and like visitors to that side are probably pretty educated, or they probably care a little about science and technology. So that might also be mediating some of the results with respect to whether or not they're willing to accept paternalistic help for themselves or for others.
Yeah, so would you predict that people that are maybe less educated might be more receptive to paternalistic policies because they recognize their own mental failures or something?
Well,
I don't know if that would be the case, but
I wouldn't put it that way, but in lab experiments with college students, for example, like they probably know that they're probably in the top 2% of the world in terms of education.
yeah.
So their receptivity to paternalism for themselves versus for others is probably mediated by a ton of demographic factors.
Yeah, so we could try to look for more moderators of people's receptiveness of paternalism for themselves. But I do think we don't have only University of Chicago students in here. I think it could be a concern if we only had University of Chicago students. The fact that we have these people on online that show the same effects, and we have people at the museums that show the same effects, makes me think that this is not too much of a concern, but thanks for the comment. Yeah?
In some of your studies, how much did you weight the culture and values in terms of particularly being paternalistic? I mean, you could decide better than someone else. I mean, because you're dealing.
What do you mean by culture?
Well, you're dealing with a lot of different demographics, and some people think this is the way we do it, but yet, some other people they want to do it a different way. I mean, so did you look at that in any of your studies?
Yeah, so one thing we measure is the familiarity with the different charities. So you can imagine, for example, we have several studies that use this paradigm around different using different types of donations to different charities. And people are just much more familiar with the more paternalistic charities, Red Cross and Oxfam, but we never found any interactions with familiarity per se. So, but that's a good question. Okay, yes?
This might be a naive question, I apologize, but
No problem.
an interpretation of your study, which I think is fascinating, and you've given me
Thanks.
language as a practitioner to communicate with funders who have more or less of a paternalistic or agentic approach.
Great. Yeah, be careful with the word paternalistic because it has a lot of connotations, but yeah.
Well, that's kind of my question is, could an interpretation of your study be, well, I believe, I as just an example, believe that it should be done more paternalistically. I just have that mindset. Therefore, I'm going to, an interpretation of your work would be, I'm therefore going to take action to help that recipient identify their own mental capacity flaws or incapabilities, so that I can apply, more directly my paternalistic.
Wait, can you explain a little bit more?
Well, so one of your, you said that it was a Thanksgiving experiment.
Uh-huh.
If you get people to
To recognize their own self-control failures.
right,
Yeah.
then that is a method to which to,
Yeah.
prerequisite to
Right.
applying your paternalistic.
Right, and you can think of interventions for recipients that might make them seem to have more mental capacity. So you could think about, for Give Directly, this affects poor people in Kenya and Uganda that seem very, very different than the types of donors. It's sort of an outgroup for most of the donors who are giving. And so just by the basis of the fact that they're outgroup members, they might tend to dehumanize them and think they don't have much mental capacity. But we can think about interventions that remind people that, yeah, these people are like you in certain ways, and so making them seem more similar and reminding them about the people's mental capacity and thinking about, we can try to humanize them in different ways. That might change the way people tend to give towards them. So exactly, it could go both ways. So I think that's really interesting. That's something we're exploring now. Yeah. Uh-huh.
People answering these questions,
What's the demographic? So it varies across different experiments. We have 6 different experiments now, but it typically tends to be, is there anything in particular that you're thinking with the?
I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Because of brand association and a number of things.
Because of what associations?
Brand association.
Brand association.
Meaning the Red Cross versus the
Oh,
Absolutely.
okay. Yeah, so it tends to be a pretty wide age range. So we have to get above 18, and then the sample goes up into like the 70s usually. But there's usually usually the mean is around 30, and then it tends to be split on gender. It's usually half and half gender. So yeah, so that I can certainly, and also we have a working paper on this, and it has all the demographic information there. I can send it to you if you email me. Yeah, and my email address is up there. Uh-huh.
So I guess so I'm not sure whether I've got the question right or not, but
Okay.
it makes me think of natural disasters in places like Japan
Uh-huh.
or, hurricanes.
Yeah,
where,
Katrina.
Where this question of mental capacity of the other is not going to be so different, right? So like if you say that it's the, it was the tsunami in Japan, right? Then you don't necessarily think that those are people who have less mental capacity than me. But then has that changed the way that I might donate? Did we, as a country, sort of donate in a different way to Japan than we might have to Kenya or Uganda?
So I don't know about comparing across groups like that. That's an interesting idea. But people might just tend to donate towards others differently than they would to themselves. And I know there have certainly been places where there have been natural disasters where people might tend to have negative stereotypes about those that were affected. So in Katrina, for example, a lot of African Americans were negatively impacted by that. And so if you tend to have beliefs about that group of people, and you tend to dehumanize them and think of them as having less mental capacity, I would propose that based on this data that would affect the way you give to them. You would tend to be a lot more paternalistic in how you try to help them. And so again here, it might be interesting to think about different interventions, that when natural disasters occur, you can try to change people's opinions about the people that were harmed, and that might affect the way they tend to give to them, which would be interesting.
Right, so my question is, were we any less paternalistic with a country like Japan than we were to a more developing country?
Maybe, I don't, yeah, that's interesting.
Sure, right?
Yeah, so thinking about the different stereotypes associated with different groups and how that affects the way.
Gave just as much to the Red Cross. I mean, right?
Yeah.
Individuals, we probably gave just as much to the Red Cross.
Yeah, and that's a great idea to look at some maybe archival data in terms of how people were giving to these different groups and whether I see differences there. Yeah, I love that. That's great. Thank you. I'm out of time, but we're going to continue. I'm going to give it over to Jan. Thank you, guys.